Siamo pronti per l'ultima relazione di oggi, del fratello Ron Barney. Come vi avevo detto all'inizio, Ron ha lavorato per 33 anni
So, as
per il
we
Dipartimento di
are
Storia della
starting,
Chiesa, che non è da
Ron worked
confondersi col
for the
Dipartimento di Storia
Department
dei
of
Servi. Voglio questo è proprio il
History of the
Dipartimento
Church,
della Chiesa, Salt Lake
and
City,
this is
e di
one of the
conseguenza
department of
lui
the church in Salt
con
Lake
il suo
City.
lavoro, con il suo
And with
gruppo, ha
his
avuto modo
work,
negli anni di lavorare con i documenti originali,
he had the
quelli
opportunity
scritti
to
da Joseph Smith
work
e da
with the
altri
original documents written by
personaggi
Joseph
all'inizio
Smith
della Chiesa,
and other
e negli ultimi
from the
anni è
beginning of the
stato
church. And in the
coinvolto
last years, he was
ai livelli più
involved
alti
in the
nella
higher level
produzione
in the
e
production and
pubblicazione
publication
dei Joseph Smith
of
Papers,
the
che è una
Joseph Smith papers
compilazione di
that
diversi
are
volumi. Il lavoro finale sarà più di 30
volumes,
volumi,
and
ogni anno
there
ne
will be more
pubblicano
than
uno o
30
due,
volumes. Each
e
year
è
they
una
publish one or
raccolta
two. It's a
molto
collection,
accurata su tutto
very
ciò che Joseph Smith ha scritto durante la sua
careful,
vita.
of what
Ad
Joseph
esempio
Smith
sono
wrote
usciti
in
già due
during his
volumi sui
life.
suoi diari,
There's
due
already
volumi
two
sulle
volumes
storie,
on his
due
journals,
volumi
on
sulle
his stories,
rivelazioni che lui ha
two
ricevuto
volumes on
scritte per i suoi
Revelations,
testi, dove
and
c'è
these are
proprio
texts
tutto, sia
where
a
you
volte le
can
illustrazioni
find
del testo originale
the
scritto a mano che i trascritti,
pictures of the original
e per farvi
text
anche vedere che comunque la
to
Chiesa non ha
show
nulla
that the
da
church doesn't
nascondere
have anything to
quando uno vuole
hide.
fare una ricerca
So if
sul
people want
materiale,
to see the material,
e lui
it's
appunto
there.
era parte di
And
questo
he is
gruppo,
part of
o
this
fa parte ancora
department.
di questo gruppo.
Ron has a great
Ron ha
knowledge on the
moltissima
history of
conoscenza
the
sulla storia
church,
della Chiesa, infatti
and
tra
among all the people
tutte le
that
persone che hanno
know that
parlato oggi
spoke today,
probabilmente è la
he is
persona
the
che ha
one
una
who has the
conoscenza maggiore del
higher
nostro gruppo,
knowledge
quindi siamo
on the
molto
history of the
onorati.
church.
Grazie, Ugo. It is a pleasure for me to be here today with you to talk about the prophet Joseph Smith. In September of 1995, Elder Neil A. Maxwell said that in the past there are those who were critical of the church, who were trying to diminish the influence of the church and attacked its authenticity, used generally the Book of Mormon and other types of attacks against the church. He said in the future that the critics of the church would go after Joseph Smith's character. Well, that rang some bells for some of us and caused us to think we need to do something about that. So since that period of time, nearly 20 years now, a number of us have invested a great deal of time trying to study and find out, as best we can, the life of Joseph Smith, so that we can properly talk about him in a way that will be authentic to the record and will also recognize his divine appointment. Today I would like to talk about just one aspect of Joseph Smith's life. This is a little bit unusual. I hope that you'll be able to understand when I am finished how important this little fact is regarding his personality. Now, I want to say at the outset that after all these years, I believe Joseph Smith to be a divinely appointed prophet of God. I feel more strongly about it right now than I ever have in my life. I think he is defendable. I think he is a truth teller, and I think all of us can count on him because the record that he reported is true. Now, what I'm going to do today is talk about Joseph Smith in a matter that will be a little bit different than just a belief in Joseph Smith as a part of our faith. I'm going to talk about the documentary record. I served for 15 years as senior archivist for the church history department. I found that documents, the historical record that survives, is the most important thing that we have when it comes to when it comes to understanding the prophet Joseph Smith, the primary evidence. The secondary evidence is the circumstantial evidence, that when we start to put things together, that things start to make a great deal of sense. I think that is particularly true when we are talking about Joseph Smith's visions, because after all, it is the visions that we say that initiated the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The third part that I want to talk about today, that is Joseph Smith's sensibility about sacred matters, is so important to understand. If we miss this, we miss a great deal about his prophetic calling and about his personality. So this is the primary focus of what we're going to talk about for just the next few minutes. And I'm going to try to end on time. President Brigham Young is once alleged to have said that the mind cannot conceive what the seat cannot endure. So I want to make sure that you're not sitting for too long, so that what I have to say will make some sense to you. Some of the critics of Joseph Smith have said that he falsified his record. Probably the first one, and she became famous for this, was a woman by the name of Fawn McKay Brodie. This woman was President David O. McKay's niece. She wrote a book in 1945 called No Man Knows My History, The Life of Joseph Smith, that for many years was the primary biography accepted in America about Joseph Smith. In it, regarding his visions, she said this: "The awesome vision he described in later years was probably the elaboration of some half-remembered dream, stimulated by the early revival excitement and reinforced by the rich folklore of visions circulating in the neighborhood. Or it may have been by sheer invention, created sometime after 1830 when the need arose for a magnificent tradition." In other words, she said, once the church got started and Joseph began to receive a little bit of disagreement from other members of the church, he made these stories up so that they would believe and wouldn't question him. Of course, nothing is farther from the truth. A number of years later, there were two men, Ed Decker and Dave Hunt, who published a book called The Godmakers. There was also a film about this that got a lot of attention in the United States. I don't know if it did here, but if it didn't, eventually somebody will probably do something with the Godmakers. In it, they made a claim similar to Fawn Brodie. They said, "All of the evidence points to the conclusion that the visionary accounts portrayed in Joseph's history of the church were fabricated in order to enhance the image of the Mormon church in the eyes of his critics and to shore up the prophet's sagging authority in the face of mounting rebellion." So he said the same thing that Fawn Brodie said. Joseph Smith, when he found himself a little insecure, decided to make up a great big story. He said, Had these events actually occurred, they would undoubtedly have been among the first proofs mentioned to prospective converts then as now. And had they been known, it is unthinkable that they wouldn't have been mentioned by anyone. One can only conclude that these crucial events for the establishment of the Mormon Church did not, in fact, ever happen. So their argument is that there is not evidence that Joseph Smith had visions, which is simply not true. But what I'm going to talk about, and I should qualify that, what they have done in saying that is they have disregarded a great amount of evidence and selectively used just a narrow portion of it that makes it look like Joseph was a falsifier. If they had have used this other evidence, no one would believe their conclusions because the evidence is so strong that Joseph Smith was telling the truth. Now, my purpose today is to examine a number of the features of Joseph Smith's personality so that you will know how a young prophet reacted when he had visions. To think that the first thing that he did after he saw the Father and the Son or Moroni or any of the other heavenly visitors was to shout, "Guess what happened to me?" and then go from door to door to tell everybody about it. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And you will see and have an understanding of that by the time that we are finished. Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. It took him only a period of about 60 days from the beginning of April 1829 to the end of June 1829, with a few breaks inside that, but roughly about 2 months, even though it took 3 months for the entire process to happen. A really remarkable feat. And all of the particulars surrounding that, if we were to just talk about that, would be evidence alone that Joseph Smith was being led by God. During the translation of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith came upon this important passage in the Book of Alma, wherein he read about how men and women of God, who when they receive information from God, need to be very careful about how they distribute it. It is given unto many to know the mysteries of God. Nevertheless, they are laid under a strict command that they shall not impart, only according to the portion of his word which he doth grant unto the children of men. In other words, those who receive information from God are under a strict command to keep it to themselves unless God tells them to distribute the information. One would think a person who had great integrity would protect those sacred things, and Joseph Smith did. In two other very important passages of material that he wrote down that was revealed to him, both of them from the book of Moses, he reiterates this important understanding. Show them not unto any except them that believe, and see thou show them unto no man until I command you, except to them that believe. Sacred information is not to be casually described. Sometimes, even in the church today, we somehow have the idea that if God has a great thing for us to do, or if we've learned something wonderful or witnessed a great event, we want to go to our fast and testimony meeting and tell everybody about it. That's not the way God reveals to His children. We're supposed to be careful about the kind of revelatory information that is given to us. If God wants somebody else to know about the same kind of thing, He'll reveal to them. He doesn't have to just do it through me. Now, I'm telling you this so that you'll understand that Joseph Smith recognized this right from the start, from the very beginning of his ministry. And I'll illustrate it in this way. Now, we've learned through our work on the Joseph Smith papers, and there are now 6 volumes that are published. There will eventually be over 20. They must be done by, I believe, the year 2012. So they will all be published by then. They're expensive to buy right now. That bothers the leaders of the church. So they have told us that once these have all been published, they'll all be put on the internet and they'll be available to everyone for free, so that everyone will be able to have access to this. And I should clarify what I just said. Instead of doing it all at the end, they will start about every 2 years after something's been published to put it on the church website. Of course, I have no idea how long it will take to get information into Italian, but hopefully somebody down the road will feel that is important and want to do that. From the Joseph Smith papers, we have learned some very interesting things about Joseph Smith. Some things that we've never learned before. Some things that have helped us to understand that the way that we have described things in the past, some of them have not been accurate. One of them is from a church movie called The Restoration. Maybe some of you have seen it. Where and I really like this film. It shows Joseph Smith coming out of the grove of trees and running toward his home, yelling, "Mother, Mother!" And the audience is led to believe that he's going to go home and say, "Guess what happened to me?" But the documentary record does not say that. In fact, Joseph Smith did not tell his mother after he came out of the grove that day. Let me tell you what he did say. And this is according to his dictation to his scribe, Willard Richards. So we know that this information came right from Joseph. He said, am I on the right one? He said, "I leaned up to the fireplace. Mother inquired what the matter was." In other words, his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, saw that he was different. And she wanted to know what had happened to her son. That would have been a good time to say, "You'll never believe this, but he didn't say that. He said, "Never mind, all is well. I am well enough off." Imagine that. He did not tell his mother because of the sacred nature of what had happened to him. The only thing that he did tell her was, I have learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true. That's all he said, which made some impression to her because she was inclined toward the Presbyterian Church and later became a member of the Presbyterian Church. So he did tell us that there was one person that he did tell his story to, someone that he thought would believe him, a local minister, a man of God. He thought, this man will understand. So he went to the man and told him, and of course, if you know the story, Joseph said, he treated my communication not only lightly, but with great contempt, saying it was all of the devil. Well, that was an enormous disappointment to him. He must have told a few other people because he said, I was severely ridiculed for what I had told people. Well, because he was a very smart person, and because if it were you, pretty soon you would stop telling anybody. And Joseph learned his lesson. He had, I think, hoped that something would open up that would allow people to hear what he had to say and then believe it. But he learned that that's not the way that Heavenly Father works through people. We've learned over the years that you have to take a very close look at the documentary record to see what it actually tells you. And we are led by the documentary record because we believe Joseph Smith was a truth teller. One of the most important scholars in the 20th century, a man named... No, I'm going to go back. No, I'm not. A man named Hugh Nibley, who taught at Brigham Young University for many years, taught us something very important. He said, one may ask, why should Joseph Smith have waited so long to tell his story officially? Now, he says that because the first account of Joseph Smith that he wrote, and he wrote this down personally himself, was in 1832. The second one, as he told it to another man with his scribe next to him, was written down in 1835. The third time was part of his history, the official history, that if you look in your scriptures, it says Joseph Smith History 1. That's this history I'm talking about now, that he began in 1838 and he became very serious about it in 1839. And then the fourth time that he repeated it, that he told that story, was in 1842. Now, some people say because each of the stories varies a little bit, that he must have made it all up. That's just simply not true. Each of those recountings of the story tell the same story, except he adds dimension to it according to the audience. The one where there is a big hang-up over this is the first time he told this story, 1832. Now that is 12 years after he told it the first time. In it, he said that a heavenly being came down to him, not to tell him which church was right, but Joseph was concerned about his own soul. So the first thing the this heavenly being, not an angel, the first thing this heavenly being, who we know was Jesus, said to him when he came down was, "Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee." That's the primary reason he went into the sacred grove, was to find out what his status was before God. A secondary reason was he wanted to know which church was right. Well, that part doesn't show up in the first telling. That part shows up in 1835, 1839, and 1842. But the 1842 also talks about his concern for his own soul. The 1835 account says one heavenly being came down first, and then a second heavenly being came down. Well, if Joseph Smith is making up this story, why doesn't he tell it exactly the same every time? It would make sense that if he were trying to fabricate and fashion a believable story, he would have done it the first time right and then just repeated it thereafter. But he fashioned his story for his audience. The last two, 1839, 1842, was prepared for public distribution. The others were private communications, and so they varied a little bit. Much work has been done on this. As you can see, there are 3 books up there, full book-length books about just the first vision. Much has been done on this, and we're very confident in the explanations that we've given about how this all fits into the context of Joseph Smith's life. I'm going to continue. I'm going to start reading again what Hugh Nibley said, and then we'll continue on. One may ask, why should Joseph Smith have waited so long to tell his story officially? From his own explanation that we've just described, it is apparent that he would not have told it publicly at all had he not been induced, and that is the word that he used, induced, to do so by all the scandal stories that were circulating. It was a rule among those possessing the gospel in ancient times that the greater teachings be not publicly divulged. Now, Hugh Nibley said that in 1961, and it is as true today. In another event that happened shortly following his recounting of the first vision in his official history, Joseph, as we know, was visited 3 times in one night by Moroni, with no sleep that night. So Moroni, he went to bed. Moroni then came to him 3 separate times and told him the same thing 3 separate times. And Joseph said, it took all night. So when everybody else got up the next morning, Joseph Smith was still awake. So they all went out to work in the field. And his father saw him and said to him, "You don't look good. Go home. Go to bed." Now that would have been a good time to say, "Father, there's a good reason for that. Guess what happened to me in the night?" But he didn't. He didn't say that. He started to go back home, and as he said, as I was climbing over a fence, the angel appeared to me again. And the angel said to him, well, I'm going to read how Joseph said it. "I found my strength so exhausted as to render me entirely unable. My father, who was laboring along with me, discovered something to be wrong with me and told me to go home. I started with the intention of going to the house, but in attempting to cross the fence out of the field where we were, My strength entirely failed me, and I fell helpless on the ground, and for a time was quite unconscious of anything. The first thing that I can recollect was a voice speaking unto me, calling me by name. I looked up and beheld the same messenger who had previously appeared to him, standing over my head, surrounded by light as before. He then again related unto me all that he had related to me the previous night, and commanded me to go to my father and tell him of the vision and commandments which I had received. In other words, Joseph wouldn't have told his father about it, about Moroni coming to him, except the angel said, no, you go tell your father what happened. And in another account, he said, and he will believe you. And he did. This illustrates this sensitivity on the part of Joseph Smith about these remarkable events that occurred to him. He kept them to himself. In October 1830, just 6 months after the church was organized, Joseph Smith was visiting at the home of the Whitmer family. And a man who became kind of famous afterward came to visit the Whitmers in order to interview Joseph Smith. He later published a book about this interview, and these are the words that he wrote. He said, I inquired of Joseph, searching into the mystery of his system of religion, and had the privilege of conversing with him alone several hours, and of investigating his writings, church records, etc. I improved, or in other words, I interviewed him near 4 hours and 20 minutes, in close application with Smith and his followers. Now, what he wanted to get was Joseph Smith to say, this is what happened to me, so that he could tell his own story. But instead, he said, Joseph could give me no Christian experience. What that meant was Joseph Smith did not tell him about any special experience that he had had with God or with Jesus. He just told him about the Book of Mormon and about some other things that were also widely known. Joseph was keeping these things to himself. Another revealing experience occurred in October of 1831. In a little village 13 miles southwest of Kirtland, Ohio, where the church was centered, there was a conference held. At this conference, there were the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer and Martin Harris. There were also 2 who were 2 of the 8 witnesses, Joseph Smith's father and Joseph Smith's brother. And there were 2 people there who would later become members of the First Presidency, Frederick G. Williams and Sidney Rigdon. Some of these men had already had visions with Joseph, had had experiences with him. This was the inner circle. These were the people who were closest to him. Okay? So in the middle of that meeting, and we have the minutes of that meeting in a record that we call the Far West Record that's kept in the church history library in Salt Lake. And those minutes, incidentally, were kept by Oliver Cowdery. He said, Brother Hiram Smith said that he thought best that the information of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon be related by Joseph himself to the elders present, that all might know for themselves. In other words, here you are, Joseph, with your closest friends. Tell us how you got the Book of Mormon. How was it produced? And guess what Joseph Smith said to him? Brother Joseph Smith Jr. said, "It was not intended to tell the world all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and also said that it was not expedient for him to relate these things." Now, isn't that interesting? Because today we go on and on telling how the Book of Mormon was translated and it was done by this particular process. The only person who ever knew about how it actually happened said, "I'm not going to tell you." And he never did. He never did. Anybody telling you how Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, it's somebody else's opinion. Because Joseph Smith never told anybody. Okay? Now, Joseph Smith tried to teach the other members of the church about this important principle about sacred matters. In November of 1832, just 6 months after the Quorum of the 12 Apostles were called, he was preparing them for the upcoming dedication of the Kirtland Temple, which was going to happen in just 5 months. And he said to them, "We must be clean every whit. Everything about us, we've got to be purified. Let us be faithful and silent, brethren, and if God gives you a manifestation, keep it to yourself." As he tried to do this, the church leaders started to think about this themselves. One of the real evidences of this, of the importance of this, is something that happened at the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. This magnificent, wonderful structure, there was a solemn assembly and an official dedication, and then after that, something quite remarkable happened. Joseph Smith said that he and Oliver Cowdery went into the upper pulpits of the Kirtland Temple and had something very remarkable happen to them. He said that, one of the things that was most remarkable about it was there was a parallel to Jesus' transfiguration on the Mount of Transfiguration as described in the 17th chapter of Matthew. So he said that after Jesus appeared to them, that Moses, Elias, and Elijah also appeared. These are his words. "The heavens were again opened unto us." "The heavens were again opened unto us, and Moses appeared before us. After this Elias appeared. After this vision had closed, another great and glorious vision burst upon us, for Elijah the prophet, who was taken to heaven without tasting death, stood before us." So Jesus appeared, then Moses, Elias, and Elijah. Now we know this story today, which is a part of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 110, because when the Doctrine and Covenants was revised in 1876, Elder Orson Pratt went to Joseph's diary, and this is the last entry in Joseph Smith's diary. That story starts right here and goes right down here. And all it did was change the tense of it from third person to first person, if that makes any sense. This is just how it appears in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 110. So it was written down right after it happened. And in fact, the person that wrote it down was Oliver Cowdery's brother, Warren. So, then in 1876, Orson Pratt took this passage out of Joseph's diary and put it in the Doctrine and Covenants. Okay? So when did the members of the church find out about this? Well, they never did in his lifetime. This story was never told until it appeared in the November 1852 issue of the Deseret News in Salt Lake City, Utah. And we can demonstrate this. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery kept this to themselves. They didn't need to tell this story. The church continued on just fine, but they didn't repeat the story. We've got to move right along here. Just to show you how Oliver had come to learn this kind of information. When Joseph Smith wrote that 1832 account of the first vision, as a part of that, he also enlarged the account to tell something that happened to Oliver Cowdery. It's the only place that it appears. He said, "And it came to pass after much humility and affliction of soul, I obtained them," speaking of the plates, again after having taken them away due to the 116 pages being lost. You know about that story. "When the Lord appeared unto a young man by the name of Oliver Cowdery, and showed unto him the plates in a vision, and also the truth of the work, and what the Lord was about to do through me, his unworthy servant." We don't tell that story. That story doesn't appear anywhere except in Joseph Smith's diary. And on top of that, as it says down here at the bottom, Joseph said that Oliver, he had kept the circumstances entirely secret and had mentioned it to no one. So Oliver also had this idea about keeping sacred things sacred. And this is not unlike what happened on the Mount of Transfiguration that we discussed before. When Jesus and his apostles were there, this is what Jesus said to them after they had witnessed this remarkable transfiguration. "Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man be risen again from the dead." Again, that's repeated in Matthew chapter 17. This helps explain, and I'm running out of time, so I can't go into the detail I would like. We've got stories about how John the Baptist came and ordained Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery to the priesthood, but we don't have any accounts of Peter, James, and John coming. There are no accounts of that. Joseph Smith kept it to himself. That's why we don't have them. I hope that this is kind of making some sense to you now. This is a pattern. This is the way that he primarily did business. Once the church came along and we had to try to tell other people that we are an authentic church, we used the things that Joseph kept private, we publicly made them known. And later on in Joseph Smith's life, he had to do that in the same way. Here is just one instance of that. In 1842, he published something called the Wentworth Letter. In it, he told the story of the first vision, and he said that between 1823 and 1827, this was the time when he had to wait until he had refined himself before Moroni would give him the plates. He said, after having received many visits from the angels of God, unfolding the majesty and glory of the events that should transpire in the last days, on the morning of the 22nd of September, A.D. 1827, the angel of the Lord delivered the records into my hand. Now notice what he says there. After having received many visits from the angels of God. So during that period of time between the age of 17 and 21, many angels visited him. listen to what Oliver Cowdery says, or read what Oliver Cowdery says about that same period. He wrote, from this, and this is Oliver Cowdery's writing, from this time, that is, that 4-year period of time, to September 1827, few occurrences worthy of note transpired. So at the same time Joseph is receiving visitations from many angels, he's not even telling Oliver Cowdery about them. Again, this is a strong indicator that Joseph Smith was keeping his private experiences private. I'm going to try and do this quickly here and close with this. One of the most important letters that Joseph Smith ever wrote was an epistle to the church that was written on September the 6th, 1842. It appeared in the church's periodical, The Times and Seasons. Later on, in fact, at the same time, when Orson Pratt revised the Doctrine and Covenants and put in section 110, he took this and made this section 128 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So what this letter is section 128 of the Doctrine and Covenants today. So you can read this. In the middle, about 2/3 of the way through his letter, in the middle of what is now verse 18, he says, Joseph Smith says this: "It is necessary in the ushering in of the dispensation of the fullness of times, which dispensation is now beginning to usher in, that a whole and complete and perfect union and welding together of dispensations and keys and powers and glories should take place and be revealed." So, in other words, in order for all of the power from the past to come to the earth, all of that from the past had to be transmitted to the present time. Okay? He said, from the days of Adam even to the present time. And not only this, after he's received all of the powers and authority from the past, he said, and not only this, but those things which have never been revealed from the foundation of the world, but have been kept hid from the wise and the prudent, shall be revealed unto babes and sucklings in this, the dispensation of the fullness of times. So he's saying that not only does he have to receive the authority from the past, but he's also got to receive more power that's never been revealed. There's no mistaking of Joseph Smith's intent here. This is how he described in very brief form what he meant. He said, "And again, what do we hear? Glad tidings from Cumorah. Moroni, an angel from heaven, declaring the fulfillment of the prophets, the book to be revealed." Now we know about Moroni and we know about the Book of Mormon. It continues, "A voice of the Lord in the wilderness of Fayette, Seneca County, declaring the 3 witnesses to bear record of the book." We know about that. We've already talked about the 3 witnesses. The voice of Michael on the banks of the Susquehanna, detecting the devil when he appeared as an angel of light. We don't know anything about that. Joseph never told anything about that at all. The voice of Peter, James, and John in the wilderness between Harmony, Susquehanna County, and Colesville, Broome County on the Susquehanna River, declaring themselves as possessing the keys of the kingdom and of the dispensation of the fullness of times. Now, we don't know if that's a separate time of Peter, James, and John, or if that was associated with the restoration of the priesthood, which Joseph didn't talk about at all. But we've never had any further description of what was happening here than what was just given. He goes on, "And again, the voice of God in the chamber of old Father Whitmer in Fayette, Seneca County. We don't even know what this pertains to. But he says this, the voice of God came to him, he says, at sundry times, meaning many times, and in diverse places, many places, through all the travels and tribulations of this Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So he was getting communications from God all along and wasn't telling anybody about it. He was even telling things about things that it was like he was almost trying to trigger our imaginations, because he went on, and the voice of Michael the archangel, the voice of Gabriel, and of Raphael. Raphael is considered one of the great archangels, but his name is not a biblical name. It appears in the Apocrypha in the book of Tobit, but it is not a part of the regular biblical record. And of diverse angels from Michael or Adam down to the present time, all declaring each one of their dispensation, their rights, their keys, their honors, their majesty and glory, and the power of their priesthood. I'm going to quit now. I could keep you here for 30 minutes more, but I know you don't want to do that. I think I've made my point. I hope. No. These other people are hungry and they'll get mad at me. I hope I've made my point. When somebody says Joseph Smith told his story later on, and that proves that he's not a prophet and that he was making these things up, that is entirely contrary to the historical record. We know from the historical record that Joseph Smith kept sacred things to himself and that he told the truth. And I bear that witness to you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.